Arkansas City, and we know we've got some other guests from Cali County in with us from Farm Bureau. So our two pages this morning are both juniors at Ark City High School, Kennedy Barnes and Geneva Herna. And if you guys wave a little bit, thank you for being here today. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Welcome to committee. Good to have you here. Committee, we will move to bill introductions. Do we have any introductions of bills? I have two. I'd like to request RS 0633, directing the Secretary for Children and Families to review and compare data for public assistance program eligibility. Are there any objections? Seeing none, that will be introduced. The second is RS 0634, directing the Secretary for Children and Families to request a waiver from Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program rules that would allow the state to prohibit the purchase of candy and soft drinks with food assistance. Any objections to that bill being introduced? Seeing none, that bill is introduced. You may have. Okay, committee, today we are going to hear on efficiency proposals that have been brought forward to this committee from the Office of the Secretary of State, and Clay Barker, the General Counsel, will be presenting for us today. So welcome to committee, Mr. Barker. A quick note, handouts are on the S drive if you want to follow along. They are uploaded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and committee, for allowing us to speak and being the first one, I guess, through the wall on this efficiency. It's something that Secretary Schwab in our office focuses on. I had talked to the chair in the past about some ideas we had, and I'm glad we were invited up here. I'm going to divide my talk into 4 points. The first is a quick summary of the Secretary of State's office. The second is on what the chair referred to as the low-hanging fruit type of efficiency improvements, those small things. Third point will be on some systemic changes that we've done, and I'll put some comments in here. And the last piece is going to be some follow-up on the regulations process, because our office gets very involved with that since we're the one that publishes all the regulations. We kind of work with all the other agencies. So first of all, in the Office of Secretary of State, I'm sure you're familiar with it, constitutional office elected every 4 years. The Secretary actually only has 4 constitutionally mandated tasks. Elections is not one of them. It's countersigning commissions and publicizing constitutional amendments and filing city ordinances. So the legislature assigns everything to the office. And in the past, the office has done everything from issuing car license plates to doing essentially what the archives and Department of Administration does. We end up with a lot of odds and ends tasks. For instance, if a major river changes course, the Secretary of State has to go buy the land that is now underwater from the farmer and sell the land that used to be underwater, but we haven't done that in decades. The agency is fee-funded, meaning it doesn't take SGF unless as an exception. Our normal operations are all funded by fees. And it costs about $5.7 million a year, and about 52% of that is employee costs, and then most of the rest is IT costs. The agency, I have a diagram in my testimony, but the agency's small. It only has about 40 employees in it. Most people think we're a lot larger than that. And the organization has 3 operating divisions that are separate from each other. Think of it like a conglomerate in business that has a lot of different things. First, the largest part is business services, 13 people. It does, amongst other things, business filings, that's the corporations, LLCs, formation documents, amendments, biannual reports, uniform commercial code filings, notaries, service of process, and things like athlete agents, cemetery financials, union filings, bonded warehouses. The next largest group is publications, which my colleague Whitney Temple heads, that does public affairs. It also publishes the Kansas Register every week, the state's newspaper, publishes Kansas regulations. We publish the session laws. We sell all the publications for the state to the public, and we run the publications warehouse, which, if you don't know, is down by the expo, and it's a corner of a smaller warehouse. And then the elections division, which gets all the attention, but is the smallest of the 3 operating divisions. We assist the 105 election officers, and we take lobbyist filings, statements of substantial interest. I'm sure a lot of you have been there if you filed for office. And we spent a lot of time gathering data from counties and giving it to the feds or sometimes the state. The two supporting divisions is IT, which is the resource constraint in the office to modernization and efficiency. The more IT people we have, the faster we can do things. It's got 7 people. It also does cybersecurity. And there's the administrative staff. I'm part of it, human resources, trademarks, and all these special filings we get from counties and states where someone at state government has to get the filing, and we get it, file it, and index it. But that's the outline of the office. And just as a example of the workload, business filings, about 205,000 a year. Notary filings, about 23,000 a year. Uniform Commercial Code, about 81,000 a year. And most of this is online. It's all automatic. Okay, moving on to efficiency. I think we're all aware that government was not designed, intentionally to be efficient. We have divided government. There's six executive branches. If you count the Board of Regents as an executive branch, and Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, divided legislature, and everything works on a consensus basis. So while government cannot run like a business, it can take a lot of ideas from them. And the reasons it can't run like a business is businesses are long-term profitable is their one goal. Government has to serve the public. There's no centralized control in government, again, split control, and a lot of public attention and transparency. And transparency can be the enemy of efficiency sometimes because you're always being watched. So moving to the small inefficiencies level, there was a quote from former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels that I've always remembered. He said it, I think, in 2014, is that you can't carve fat out of a government the way you can carve fat off a steak. It's more like marbled meat. The fat is spread all through it. It's all these little things that slow the process down. And I believe that part of the reason those small things are there is because for a lot of agencies, they know where the small problems are, but it's not worth the effort, the return on investment of writing a bill, going through the legislature, trying to get a phrase removed from a statute, knowing that it may not get through. There's not really opposition to it, but the majority leader may not bring it above the line. It may get gut and goad because it's not a pressing issue. And so a lot of agencies just sit on these inefficiencies knowing they're there. The process we use to spot inefficiencies, if we want to look for something to eliminate, we first say, does anybody care about this filing we get or the service we provide? Has anyone asked for it in the last decade? And you can tell if people are checking things online. The business filings, there's thousands of people checking it every day, banks, lawyers, so those are obviously useful. And then we do a quick historic research. When was this mandate passed? Why was it passed? And what has changed that nobody seems to care about it anymore? And it's interesting, you can go through files and find stickum notes from the 1980s saying, we need to get rid of this statute. And it's still there. It's kind of a tell. And one of the reasons this happens, as an example, is the Kansas Secretary of State used to be on the second floor of the Capitol until 2000. I doubt any of you remember that. Maybe Senator Schallenberger does. Pre-internet days, everything the public might want to see was sent to the Secretary of State because people would come in the building and they could ask for it and get a paper copy. Now that we've gone internet and our office has moved out of the Capitol, nobody thinks to go to the Secretary of State for filings, yet some of these legacy filings still come to us. And that's a reason there's a change and why something's no longer needed. Another process we use is if we see rejected filings, we'll say, do we need to be requesting this piece of information? It's usually in the statute. We go to the bankers and the lawyers and say, do you need this piece of information? We tend to reject filings because of it. If they say no, we bring a bill to the legislature and ask for it to be removed. Some of the things we've managed to change in the last few years, one, we eliminated blanket music licenses, and I didn't know what those were either, but we would get, and I mean literally, twice a year, boxes this high from 2 agencies in New York with every license that allowed a business to play music in the background. We were the only state that required it. No one ever looked at it. None of the lobbyists knew it was there. I called the organizations in New York. They had no idea why we wanted it, and we just put it in a bill to repeal the statutes. We made sure the legislature knew what we were doing, and it's gone. And I got a phone call from one of the lawyers in New York who thanked us and offered to take the entire legislature out to lunch because it took a burden off them, and I didn't take them up on that. But another thing we've done is regulations. Used to be in books. If you actually have a regulation book in your office, you can toss it. They've all been online for 2 years. But to actually know what the regulation was, you need to have the base book, the supplement book, and then the Federal Register to make sure you've got the most recent one. And we had the legislature pass a law that said it went from paper to paper or internet. 2 years later, no one noticed the books were gone, and we went back to the legislature and got rid of the paper. So now it's only online. That's the official version. And regulations, as you know, come out all year long, so you have to constantly look for the latest update. That's an efficiency we've gained. The Kansas Register used to be a paper newspaper that would get mailed out to a long list. Now it's only online, and people can get it for free. So that's another efficiency that we're trying to leverage technology. We no longer are required to use the state printer. We have the option of finding the cheapest source for government printing from us, and we actually put that in the statute in 2 different places. And our warehouse for publications, we've reduced the footprint by 75%, which means less rent for the state. The bill that I introduced on the first day of this session that I'll be bringing to you, and I'll talk a lot more about that if the committee decides to take testimony, is we're eliminating some filings where one agency creates a report, which is where you'd logically think it would be, and they have to file it with us. And these other agencies are glad to get rid of the task. It's not a big savings, but it's a small one, and it adds up. And also some public groups that file things with us that no one ever looks at. And these are laws that were created in the 1920s. It's one of the ones that stick them in the 1980s. It said after a tax law change, we no longer need this bonded warehouse licensing, but we're still doing it. And some future goals is, and those savings will be 600 staff hours in the first year, which is mainly that we don't have to use IT to update our system for it, and then 50 hours a year going forward, savings. Future small goals, we want to get rid of our publications warehouse, and Ms. Temple's working on that. And we've worked with the reviser. They say there's lots of secret space down in the basement of the Capitol where books can go, and hopefully we'll just get rid of that and take it off the state's budget. We're also digitizing a lot of regulations. And my 2 recommendations on combating these small inefficiencies, and I'm not sure if this is doable, the reviser would have to chime in. If there was a way to have a basket bill where agencies, small boards could come and say, we need to get rid of this filing, and it would go in a large bill, this committee could review it, ask for testimony if it wanted, but that would make it less burdensome on the agencies to identify their problems and bring it to the legislature, and then maybe like the Cora updates every year, the legislature could then bring a large bill and knock off all these small inefficiencies. I don't know if that would work. It was an idea some of our people had. I also believe the executive side needs to do a better job of getting a culture of spot the inefficiencies and bring it to our attention, because there's nothing like the staff that have been there for 20 years that can tell you where the small problems are. You don't need to be outside government to see it. You can see it. You just have to have that faith that people will act on your issues. All right, moving on to the second level of efficiency gains is systemic change, as the chair brought out on the first day. That's like re-engineering, integrating technology. Some of the things that our office has done in the past is we've worked with sister agencies and realigned responsibilities. And generally, these are where a filing was split, or maybe in hindsight, it was given to the wrong agency. So we've moved things like the Safe at Home program, charities, professional fundraisers to the Attorney General, because they were initially split between our office and the Attorney General. And there's a time to split responsibility. It would be if you need 2 areas of expertise or a check and balance, but otherwise it's an inefficient way of doing business where you file it with one agency, then it has to pass it to another one. We've worked with the insurance commissioner, and there's a filing called a professional employer organization that probably should have been with the Secretary of State 10 years ago, but it was given to the insurance commissioner, and the commissioner and the secretary agreed that it would be moved. We passed a bill last year. We'll do a little cleanup this year, and that just and the trade organization is very happy with this. It's just a win-win for everyone. And leveraging technologies, notaries now can be, all online. It's something the legislature wanted to do. We did the IT backup for it, and now notaries don't have to be physically watching you sign. They can watch you through video and sign. So Kansas jumped on that, and that was done several years ago, right after COVID. Some systemic change that's almost complete is our office had been on a 1980s level computer system up until 2020, and then we started replacing it with a brand new system. That means new hardware, migrate the data from the 1980 systems to a 2020 system, and code brand new software for everything that's filed. It's a huge task. COVID threw it off by a year, but we have it in place, and now every couple weeks, a new filing is now able to be done completely online. So it's faster, cheaper, easier for the customer, 24/7 access to information and filing. And so that is moving along very well. And that allows us to reduce our fees, which I think is a representation. You gain efficiencies, you get more money, so you can either reduce your fees, since we're all fee-funded, or you can spend the money on something else. But we're going to be reducing our fees. That's all done by regulation. You won't see that bill, but it's eliminating some, reducing others. And the piece that we're working on for restructuring, it probably can't be done this year, is a lot of filings, and this gets back to that when we were in the Capitol, campaign finance, lobbyist filings, substantial interest filings. They come to our office, and all we do is scan them in and pass them to governmental ethics. But it's work for us, and if you've ever noticed, there's 2 websites that have campaign finance. It's our office and ethics. We think that as the official holder of the record, we're supposed to have it on our website. Ethics thinks they're supposed to have it, not that there's a fight over it. But we think, and ethics is glad to do this if they can get the backroom work, is move all that completely to ethics. So it takes the Secretary of State out of it, since we really don't do anything with that information. But that's going to be a large bill that has to be very systemically put through the system to make sure all the little issues are moved. And because of all this endless work on looking for efficiencies, the office has gone from 2011, when Secretary Kobach showed up, there were 47 full-time employees. Now we're at 15, and 15 part-time. When Secretary Schwab showed up, it was down to 40 full-time and 9 part-time. And today, plus or minus 1, there's 36 full-time and 3 part-time. So we've managed to cut the staffing by almost 25% over a little more than a 10-year period. And that's the result of just adding up all these small inefficiencies, or getting rid of them. And now, Madam Chair, I'll move on to regulations, which I know we talked about, I think, 2 meetings ago. Some observations on the process. First of all, I know there's sometimes a disconnect between what the legislature thinks it's legislating and what an agency puts out in regulations. I hear it all the time. I've been through JCAR. It's got a reputation of being one of the hotter committees in the Capitol. People fear going there. I think part of that is because the legislature tends to see things from a very broad perspective, where they're balancing all sorts of considerations. They have a vision of what they think, and the agency is down there. I don't think they do this intentionally. Maybe someone will try to veer from the legislature's intent, but the people writing it tend to have a very narrow view. My job is to focus on this small piece to it, and it can get a little out of line. Except for the largest agencies, most agencies don't have they don't have a revisor to write the regulation for them. They don't have the expertise to write them. They don't always understand the overall process, and our office ends up helping a lot of people through the process. They're just not familiar with it. There's no single agency that is in charge of regulations, unlike the revisor that does statutes. Briefly, and I put a flow chart in my notes or in my testimony, the agency writes it. They go to Department of Administration, which has an entire manual about how to write a regulation correctly. And they'll go back and forth a few times until Department of Administration says it's okay. Then it goes to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General's role is to determine whether the regulation is legal, including whether making the regulation is within the authority conferred by the law. Some people think that's not the Attorney General's job, but their job is to make sure that the grant of authority from the legislature is being followed by the agency. So sometimes the agency is surprised when a legislature thinks the agency's gone outside what the scope was when they've had the Attorney General approve it. And then it goes to budget, JCAR, public hearing, and then eventually it's adopted. And that process can take a few months. It can take more than a year. And at every step of the way, if your regulation gets rejected, it's back to the beginning. So it's like, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go try again, start. So that's why it can take a long time to get a regulation out. Recently, the 5-year review law was passed, which I think had great benefits because it forced every agency to look at every regulation and sign off that they were good. And what it caused is actually a surge of new regulations. And you were given a chart last time that looked like this. And one of the in my testimony, I've circled 2 things. One of them ended in 2023. And then in 2024, when you get the results of the 5-year review, we went from amended regulations, 129 for 23 to 212, new regulations 36 to 217, and revoked 100 to 197. So it actually caused a surge of regulations, but that's because you force the agencies to look at everything. And we found agencies that had been eliminated 20 years ago, still had regulations, didn't affect anybody, but we removed them. And Senator Thompson had asked about a statistic on that chart about inactive regulations. There are 8,000. And I checked on the definition of that. That is every regulation that has ever existed at any time that no longer is in effect. Most of those are repealed. So we still have them on our books, because sometimes people need to know what the regulation was 20 years ago, but they're not like sitting there and people are following them, but the agency doesn't want them. It's just how we track the regulations. And on the REINS Act, which was passed last year, some of the bigger businesses are waiting to see what the process the legislature is going to use to bring regulations that cost more than $1 million in 5 years through the legislature. Because there's the Supreme Court case that was mentioned last time about the separation of powers. And we get calls on that sometimes, and we'll turn them over to the reviser, and the reviser will politely say, not quite there yet, working with leadership. One of the big changes we're making that doesn't require legislation, does require funding, and again, Ms. Temple's running this one, is right now the regulation process is in 1965, all paper, wet ink stamp system. You carry files around between agencies. And we want to put it online. So it's a lot like what the reviser does for editing bills, and then what the public sees, the bills out there. So you can get online and see what is the regulation. Therefore, you can get more input and more transparency on the process. And it would just bring a lot of, I think, cost efficiencies. And it'd make it easier to track regulations, public notice. And so that's a project we're working on. The RFP's in. We're working with the budget committees. I think we're testifying today, asking for that. That would be SGF money, because it's a one-time startup cost. And again, no agency's in charge of the process, so Secretary Schwab volunteered to I guess, jump on that hand grenade of asking for money from the legislature when he knows money's tight. Next piece on regulation is legislation. I'll be bringing a bill as soon as I get the RS number to make some small changes to the 5-year bill. And this was actually brought into the legislature last session. It passed 120 to 0, 40 to 0, and then it got gut and goed. But it fixes some minor problems with the 5-year. One is the legislature listed about 130 agencies to be reviewed, and about 25 of those no longer exist. That just causes a little confusion. And there was a provision that required an agency to have a hearing if someone from the public asked for it, but no guidance on how to tell the public that they could ask for a hearing. And the joke amongst the agencies was, how do you give notice to give us notice? And we came up with a solution to that where all think of them as the 4 main agencies. We have monthly meetings a lot of times to help implement statutes. It's Department of Administration, Department of Budget, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of State. Came up what we think was a fair process, gave plenty of notice to the public, and told other agencies, if you do this, you should be safe. So you can go through and use expedited repeals and some of the tools this bill gave them. Another piece that I think, and I've shopped this around to agencies, but I don't have a bill, is right now, you go through this entire process of regulation, Department of Administration, AG, budget, and you're almost at the end. Everybody's approved it. It's bounced around, and you've rewritten it 10 times, and you have 2 last pieces of input. JCAR, the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations, which cannot stop a regulation, but it gives input, and the public hearing. And they're at the very end of the process. And there are times when you've got a regulation that's done, and somebody has an idea. Maybe they don't like something, or it's a good idea, but the finish line is right there, and you just want to get that regulation done. And I think a better process would be to have a lot of this public input at the front end. So the agency gets input from the public before they even start drafting the regulation. You still have a hearing at the end when people look at the final product. But I believe that would be, it'd be an extra step in the process, but an agency could put out notice, we plan to amend this regulation or write one, give us your input, and they have to tell interested parties, trade organizations, whatever, that they're doing that. And we would like to follow up with that, make sure that that idea seems to work. But a lot of the agencies don't have any objection to that. I think it would make it better that they can get input early on in the process. And then 2 recommendations we had that don't require legislation is one, no agency is allowed to write a regulation unless the legislature authorizes it. And they usually, as you were told, use language like shall or may. Sometimes I get activists think I sneak into my office, 2 in the morning with a candle and write a regulation under there and just issue it the next morning, and they don't understand the whole process, that agencies can't act unless the legislature allows them to. And some of the problems with the granting language in statutes, sometimes the language is ambiguous. May and shall are clear, but every now and then one is written where it almost says if. If you write a regulation, people must follow it. And you want to say, well, of course they have to follow it, but are you telling me to write it, or is that a shall or a may? There's a problem occasionally, and I talk to Ms. Shelley about this every year, where a statute says you shall write a regulation, and the agency says, but there's nothing to write. The statute covers everything. So you have an order to write a regulation, but you don't want to write a regulation just to write one. And the way the process is you can't write a regulation that merely restates the statute. It'll get rejected for that. It's got to give extra detail. And so we get stuck in this infinite do loop of every year the legislative research will say, we've noticed that this statute in 2016 said you shall write regulations. Have you written it yet? And we politely write back and say no, because there's nothing to write. And then Secretary Kobach did this conclusion on one statute that affects us. Secretary Schwab has had 2 reviews of it and came to the same conclusion. So we're not sure how to get out of that issue. You don't want to disrespect the legislature on that, but you don't want to write regulations just to write them. A second problem is when the legislature puts an adopt-by date on a regulation. You will adopt a regulation by this date. And the problem is nobody controls the process. The person who signs the final adoption doesn't control how long it takes administration or the AG or budget to do their piece to it. And it's like you feel helpless. You're told to adopt it by a certain date, but you can't do it, especially if the date is very short. And the only way I found to speed up the process, this happened to us last year, is there was a bill on the House floor, and they really needed a regulation. And I said, well, it's sitting at someone's desk. If you call, and the Speaker and the Majority Leader called the official responsible, and that regulation magically levitated off the desk and was done in a few hours. But, I mean, you don't want to have to call in firepower like that to move something along quicker. But the adopt-by dates can be a problem. And I would have 2 suggestions just generally, and I've talked to the revisers about this too. If the legislature can put buffers or guidelines on the regulatory grant, you can write a regulation, but it can't do, fees cannot be above this. It cannot be increased more than 1% of this. Or another way of doing it, and some statutes have this, it's very specific grants. You will write a regulation on this tiny little part and do this. You will write a regulation on this that does this. So you've hemmed in the regulation writer, and I think they would appreciate that, knowing they don't have an open field to do whatever they want. They're limited. And that would require more work and thought into what the regulators do, but that could be a solution. And the last piece I have is, I think the executive branch, again, this is not really a legislative issue, needs to do a better job of educating its own agencies on how to write regulations. So the point of contact in the agencies, the big ones have people that do this full time, KDHE or AG, to how to write them, what the process is. Because I give people advice all the time. If you go to the State Rules and Regs Board, this is what you need to do. If you go to JCAR, watch out for this. Or here's how the problems you need to look out for. I think we all could do a better job of educating some of the agencies on the process, then we get a better product and less concerns from the legislature. And on my testimony, I'll just end with this. I had some attachments. These are things on our website. You can ask for a newsletter that will tell you every time a regulation is up for public hearing by subject matter or the agency that issues it. You can get all the regulations online that are current up to the second. You get calendars of when regulations go into effect. We've also given lots of tools to anybody that wants it. How to write a transmittal letter to the Attorney General. They have their requirements. How to do this, how to do that. Format for a public hearing so you make sure you check all the blocks in the statute. So the tools are out there, but I think we all could probably do a better job of educating the rest of government and how regulations are working. And that would create a faster, better regulations, which then would lead to more overall government efficiency. And with that, Madam Chair, I will end my testimony and stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. And I want to thank you and the Secretary of State's office for being proactive and looking at ways to have efficiencies, and appreciate you sharing those with this committee. And I hope that this has been helpful in understanding kind of how if you look at that flow chart about regulations and how they flow, it sheds some light on how we've gotten to where we are and why we need to look and have some efficiencies. So with that, committee, I will open it up for questions. Senator Holscher.
Thank you. Thank you, Clayton, for being Thank you, Clay, for being here. I'm just curious, in light of the FTEs and the part-time staffing that you've decreased. Obviously, you've put some efficiencies in place to address that. I'm curious, like, how much of an impact technology and upgrades in technology have had in your ability to reduce employees.
Senator, I think the technology upgrades have a lot to do with it. That tasks that used to take people hours can now be just done online. And I'll give you a campaign example to sort of illustrate this. Is back when I started campaigns in 2010, you'd go around to people's houses with a clipboard, write down the information, give it to a clerk who would enter it into an Excel spreadsheet at night, and you'd get a printout the next morning. Now we all walk around with those apps on the phone and you just type it in directly and boom, it's there. And that's where technology, like in our office, you can just do filings directly online. It's not an attachment to an email. It's not a paper copy that gets scanned in. You just fill in the form and bang, it's done. And that then reduces the number of staff hours that are needed. We no longer take fax filings, if you all remember what a fax machine is. And so because of that, it reduces the number of people, and you can slowly bring down your FTEs. It's not like you find a job and say, this is no longer needed. We just need fewer and fewer hours, and now somebody leaves, and we don't need to replace them. And because we're a small agency, we do a lot of like the person who's responsible for Uniform Commercial Code is also the backup or auditor for cemeteries and mortuary firms, and the person that does HR also does the trademarks. Everybody's got a main task, and they're cross-trained in something else. So we're pretty tight on people, that we don't have a lot of excess there, but we try to maximize what we've got.
Senator Shane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Parker, for coming in and sharing your insights with us. As we look forward to do this, would you recommend then the legislature consider just an annual efficiency bill that looks simply at statutory cleanup, so that current processes, that statute matches these small, kind of incremental gains in a way that the agencies can all come to the legislature with these, I'll say, low-hanging fruit, small proposals?
Senator, that was I've talked to people in other agencies, and the council chat with each other sometimes about other things and bring this up. That was a concept. I don't know if it's doable, if it works within the rules of how the legislature works, but essentially have a bill where everybody can bring their idea to it and put it in, the revisor can help write it, and it can be reviewed by the committee to make sure no one's trying to slip something big through, or they don't realize there's an unintended consequence. But my guess would be, if our agency can find all these, and I have a spreadsheet of all 850 statutes that tell us to do something, that other agencies probably have similar things. And maybe that's a way of making it, again, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say hopefully so, but maybe not. Yeah.
And again, I think it's a cost benefit. The agency looks at it and says, I can save 5 man-hours or person-hours by getting rid of this phrase in a statute, but it will cost me 30 hours to go to the legislature and follow it through. So they just sit with the problem because it's not bad, it's just there.
Thank you for the insight.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Clay. This is excellent testimony, excellent work, very thoughtful. I appreciate this. With regard to the REINS Act and what's happening at the federal level, as it trickles down this way, you mentioned that it doesn't run afoul of the Supreme Court's decision with Stephan versus Kansas House of Reps. Could you expound on that just a little bit, what you see coming from the federal level, that efficiencies may be incorporated here at the state level?
Well, okay, on the REINS Act, I think you are probably familiar with it. If a regulation costs more than $1 million over 5 years, the legislature must give it a thumbs up. And the reviser was working with leadership on what's the process you would use to do that. Is it a resolution? Is it a bill? Does the governor have to sign it? It wasn't completely clear. And so we're waiting on that. And I think part of the concern was this old 1980s case that said essentially the legislature can't give regulatory authority and then essentially take it back by canceling. And I've been assured that it'll be worked out. So we're kind of waiting on that process to come out. And we've had some individuals from either gaming or lottery had called up and said they've got their constituents are waiting for that decision. They want to know if they can bring an omnibill where they have several regulations in one shot, or does each have to be separate? Those are the little procedural decisions. And I'm not sure what I don't quite follow your question, Senator, on the federal.
I didn't know what kind of an impact that RAINS Act at the federal level would have at the state level, if any at all.
I know there's a federal version of it, and we have a state version. And one of the differences in Kansas, we have a different process to adopt regulations. We have, for instance, the Attorney General weighs in on whether the agency's actually following the legislature's intent. I think at the federal level, you have two problems. An agency will take an old grant of authority and reinterpret it to expand it to something that nobody ever intended at the beginning. And maybe they're in good faith, maybe they're just trying to be over lawyerly about it and try to take over another part of the country. Another is where there's an exception granted that says, okay, a certain official can make a one-time exception for one person with unusual circumstances, and then suddenly the president signs an order saying this will apply to 500,000 people, which wasn't the intent. Or a regulator may do that, but I don't really see those problems in Kansas so much. Maybe, I mean, I live in my world. Maybe you all have seen that, but.
And on your suggestion on the adopt by date, when we're wanting to expedite something, what would you recommend instead of setting a date? What do you think would work better?
Senator, I'm not sure on that. I'm not sure if the legislature putting some indication that this regulation is really important and needs to come out with maximum speed, and then all the administration, Attorney General, Secretary of State budget would know that one's got to go to the top of the pile. I'm not sure how you would
Yeah, I mean,
do that, but
what triggers that sort of review and things like that. So, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, it's glad you brought it to the.
And I know when you're working on efficiency, like with there's a tendency to say how many regulations are out there, and just realize, I use that too, but a regulation could be one sentence, it could be 10 pages. Right. So when you hear these ideas of, well, for every new regulation you issue, you must get rid of 2, it's kind of, it doesn't really work, because if somebody really wanted to be snarky, they would just take 2 regulations, cut and paste, add them to a 3rd one, and, just get around it that way. I mean, it's a valid metric, but it's not always the best.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Mr. Barker, I recall you, I don't know if you said it to this committee, but when we were visiting about this, can you let the committee know how long it typically takes for the process to work, for a regulation to get done by the time it goes to the AG and bounces all over? I think you told me it was like 6 to 9 months, if I remember.
Okay, Senator, it will depend on how much work needs to go into it. If it's simply you're making a small amendment, like changing a phrase or a word, it could go through in 2 to 3 months. You'd have to make sure you have the public hearings, I think a 60-day notice, that takes a while. If it's a new reg or a larger reg, I've talked to the Department of Administration, they say they've rejected a regulation, these are the real long, like nursing regulations, 5 or 6 times. And the Department of Administration is not allowed to touch the actual wording. They mark it up like an English paper in high school, and they send it back, and the agency's got to make the changes, no matter how small or big. And once they get through them, then it goes to the Attorney General, and they have a duty to not only look at the amended part of the regulation, but the entire regulation, if you're amending it. And so I've had one rejected, not for what I wrote, but for an older provision they wanted rewritten. So do that back to the beginning. Those can take a year or more to get through. And we had one where we were almost done, and a lawsuit was brought. We had to stop working until the lawsuit was finished. So sometimes there's other things that can delay it. It's not that people are dragging their feet, or at least I hope not, but sometimes the process just takes a while because some of these regulations are pretty big and complicated.
And do you know, I don't know if you know this or not, but is that typical of other states as well, their process and how long it takes other states?
Senator, I thought about that last night when I was looking at my testimony, I don't know. I know our system's different than the federal level. I can't compare it to other states.
It might be interesting if other states have a system that expedites that process. I don't know.
Ms. Temple just told me that other states are putting their regulations online, which does speed up the process.
Okay. Be interesting to look at that. Committee, what other questions do we have? Seeing none. Again, thank you so much for sharing this and bringing this and for all the work you guys are already doing to look for efficiencies. Appreciate it very much. I'm sure we'll hear more from you as we work some bills.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee.
Committee, we will also, I believe, next week, just as a heads up, be hearing, I think, from the insurance department on how they have tackled some efficiencies in their office. So we'll all get another view from an agency as to what they're doing. So is there any other business before the committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned.